Once she stood at the center of Canadian art. After death, Prudence Heward's work simply vanishes into obscurity. In a world of male masterpieces, women's art has a tendency to disappear. For 30 years, Prudence Heward spends every morning alone, painting in her third-floor studio. But she works with the encouragement and support of a tightly knit group of women artists. In January 1920, Prudence Heward and her friends, Anne Savage and Sarah Robertson, join a new association of Canadian painters. They call themselves the Beaver Hall Hill Group, in honor of the Montreal street where their studios are located.
Did you see the paintings? Yeah. I went yesterday. What did you think?
Drawn together by common experiences and a shared artistic vision, their motto becomes, "This above all, to thine own self be true." From the time she is old enough to pick up a pencil, art has been an essential part of Prudence Heward's life. A shy, physically delicate child, she spends hours alone filling up her sketchbooks with drawings. Her eldest sister, Dorothy, offers praise and encouragement. An artist in her own right, Dorothy sketches illustrations for the newspaper, while Prue concentrates on subjects closer to home. Prue will return again and again to the faces of her family as subjects for her paintings. The gaze of a child becomes an open window onto the soul of the future adult.
It must have gone on for at least 10 days. And I sat for 3 hours with breaks quite often, because being 4 years old, it was rather, tough time. And then we'd break for halfway through the morning for hot chocolate and cookies, and that was a big drawing card for me.
Even her father winds up posing for the young artist. An official with the Canadian Pacific Railway, Arthur Heward is an artist at heart.
Apparently, my grandfather loved the theatre, was very involved with the theatre, and loved music. But I would have thought his love of the theatre may have sort of translated in a funny sort of way to Aunt Prue's need to paint. It's hard to say what real influence he might have had. The strong influence was always my grandmother. She was, as I say, matriarchal, Victorian, and very, very present.
Elegant and straight-laced, Aoife Heward is just one in a long line of matriarchs.
I found all the women of that area a little on the critical side. You know, sometimes I'd be damned if I didn't, be damned if I don't, you know. I found her, I don't know how to classify her. She was my you know, I never sort of thought about it very much. She was my grandmother, and I admired her tremendously. She certainly ran a very tight ship with her house.
Aoife Heward rules her 8 children like subjects in a private realm. In the end, she will outlive all but one. In May 1912, her eldest daughter Dorothy dies during her first pregnancy. For Prue, Dorothy's death means the loss of her closest friend. The same week, Prue's father dies. For a shy 16-year-old girl whose own health is fragile, this loss must have seemed impossible to bear. From that point onward, people will observe that there is a watchful sadness about Prue. Prue's friend Anne Savage will experience a similar loss. When the world declares war in 1914, Anne's twin brother Don joins the army. Two years later, he is killed at the Battle of the Somme. In November, Anne's family travels to their summer home at Lac Wanish to grieve. Standing at the window, with palette and paint, Anne sketches the Laurentian landscape that her brother loved. She calls the final painting For Dawn.
That doesn't look like a man's picture. That's kind of perhaps woman's grief, you know, if there's a difference. As the years went by, I realized in Montreal and other cities and all across Canada, a lot of those men volunteered and went overseas and were lost, you know. The trench warfare was ghastly, and they went down, which left big holes in these families, such as my mother's family. So the women were left. It made these women very strong-minded.
Years later, Anne will describe the impact of her brother's death.
I was left with this feeling of trying to do something to make up for that loss. I think it was the basis of why I became a painter. It fired me to go on. It was at the root of everything I did.
Prudence Heward will be lucky enough to stay near her family during the war. In 1914, she and her mother pack up house and head for England.
My grandmother was a very gutsy lady, and I think that's why, you know, that was why she she wanted to go over to be close to her children.
The war leaves its mark on all the Heward children, but it leaves the deepest scar on Prue's sister, Honor. Driving an ambulance at the front, Honor witnesses the horrors of trench warfare. Scenes of death and destruction that haunt her for the rest of her life.
I think she was very young to be there. When she was over there, the great flu epidemic was on, and she got flu dreadfully when she was there, which ended up turned into a very bad nervous breakdown. So I guess it was just a dreadful strain on her because she was such a young person. She talked about it a lot afterwards. She had good times over there. She met my father over there. They certainly had good times, there's no question about it.
For Prue, life in London means trips to galleries and exposure to the new wave of European art.
Someone who is interested in art would have been interested in the work of the British Vorticists. These were the modernists, artists who were following the ideas of pure form and shape and color. And she probably saw exhibitions, although we have no evidence of this. And through her cousin, Mary Harvey, she was probably, we think, introduced to the Omega workshops as well.
Dedicated to the revolutionary theories of Roger Fry, the Omega Group forms as an artists' collective. Furniture and fabric, canvas and wood, every surface can be used to create a total world of art. Roger Fry's ideas and his paintings will inspire Prue's work for years to come. When she returns from England, painting is more than a pastime. It becomes an obsession and passion. One she is lucky to share with her best friend, Sarah Robertson.
I think that some of the more fun times Aunt Prue had in life were with Sarah. They went off sketching together and would talk art together, and they just had a lovely time together.
Sarah and I went for a walk on the mountain today. Such a lovely day, brilliant sunshine. Anyone walking behind us overhearing such conversation as this might think us mad. Sarah, what color do you see the snow? Me. Yellow, red, and green trees. Sarah, I see the trees blue. Me. I see the snow blue-green in the shadows. Sarah. No, violet. Enough said.
United by a love of nature and art, Prue and Sarah will remain inseparable companions. Together with Anne Savage, they form the nucleus of a larger group of women who study at the Art Association of Montreal under Canadian painter William Brimner. Composition, color, and light. A disciple of the Impressionists, Brimner's taste in art is more eclectic than the average Montrealers. He encourages his students to explore new trends, while local galleries cater to a popular taste for imitations of the great Dutch masters.
So I think it was very important, the access that they had to Brimner, because of his encouragement of individual styles, but also because he introduced the idea of French modernism, which incorporated the figure as a legitimate practice.
The people and the land. Sarah Robertson's impressionistic painting, Le Repos, combines the twin obsessions that drive the work of the Beaver Hall women. As Anne Savage discovers, an obsession for landscape also inspires another group of Canadian artists. In 1919, Anne sees Tom Thompson's paintings for the first time. Canadian art will never be quite the same. Critics call them the Hot Mush School. They call themselves the Group of Seven, and A.Y. Jackson is their designated leader. A tireless organizer, Jackson also leads the Beaver Hall Group, and he forms lifelong friendships with the women members.
He was a most outgoing personality in his general manner and appearance, and friendly and gregarious, and could make friends with everybody. But then he had his quiet times, retiring times, sometimes gloomy, silent times, and then you see he didn't marry, and so he was alone quite a bit. And I always think that that's what made him such a good letter writer. Helped. He was wonderful, communicated by letters, because he didn't have to put the kids to bed and go out playing bridge.
My dear Sarah, you and your gang show up very well. Your autumn storm looks much better than it did at the RCA. We borrowed your painting Blue Sleigh, too. Dear Prue, just you keep on painting and don't bother about people's opinions. You take your place among the best half-dozen painters in Canada, so just keep on working, and everything is going to be all right. So cheerio, old dear, and all good wishes. As ever, dear Alex, I'm one of those rough birds from the big open spaces. We just say hell when the north wind blows, and then take a chew of chocolate and squeeze out some more frozen paint.
While A.Y. Jackson and the Group of Seven are out hiking and paddling through the uncharted northern wilderness, Anne Savage sets out to explore the countryside near her summer home at Lac-Wanish.
My real locale was a little lake in the Laurentians. It had something quite extraordinary about it, a very intimate feeling. There were beautiful birches and elm trees and the little wild apples, wild roses. The country around it is very undulating. You only have trees and reflections, little hills and ravines. Without going more than a short distance, you can sit down and have a complete composition, or turn the other way and have something completely different.
And people used to call it Anne's Lake because she painted it so many times. I think up close is more comfortable for a woman than great sweeps like Lauren Harris, say, or jagged mountain peaks, or those great hills that Jackson did. I think they probably saw things that they loved, you know, that were part of their lives, window boxes and trees and apple trees, and children when they could do figures.
The landscape that inspires Anne Savage and her friends is one where the human hand can be seen and felt. After attending the Minneapolis School of Design, Anne dreams of heading to New York to continue studies in art. In 1922, her father dies. As the last unmarried daughter, Anne does what is expected of her. She stays at home to care for her aging mother, takes a teaching job, and spends every spare moment painting the countryside she loves. Although Anne will travel across Canada to teach and paint, she will remain close to her childhood home for the rest of her life. Prue's friend Sarah Robertson suffers a similar fate. When Sarah's father dies in 1926, her family is left to a life of genteel poverty. Her mother's behavior becomes more and more erratic. Still grieving for her husband, perhaps terrified at the thought of losing a child, she puts Sarah's sister to bed for 10 years, despite the fact that there is nothing wrong with her health. Life for Sarah will be a constant struggle. With no money of her own, she is trapped at home by a mother she can never leave. Art becomes her only escape. Self-expression, her greatest freedom.
There's a lovely photograph of her that you probably have, showing her crouched down on the ground working away. She was darling. She was very small and lithe and all over the place.
In Montreal, Sarah lives in a predominantly English neighborhood, but it is surrounded by the influences and icons of French-Canadian Catholic culture. Just outside the window of her Fort Street home, Sarah finds a subject to match her sensibilities. Like Sarah, Prue finds inspiration within the narrow social confines of a woman's world. Windows become a recurring motif in her art. Prue will continue to paint still life and landscapes, but her greatest exploration will take her deep into the complex territory of human nature and the mysteries of the human face. Capturing the essence of a person, the inner workings of emotion. It is with her portraits of women that Prue experiences her first and most lasting success.
I can't help but feel the reason she painted women was she felt strongly, maybe, that, a woman's being, woman's role, and that this was something that she understood and that she knew.
Prue and her friends lead lives restricted by what society deems appropriate behavior for daughters of the middle class. High tea at 4, witty remarks and polite self-control. A world of empty formalities that becomes increasingly suffocating. despite the restrictions, wealth does bring advantage.
And Prudence, perhaps the most of that group, was able to define her world in terms of her own ideas. She wasn't dependent upon patrons. She wasn't dependent upon the market at all. And there is a tremendous amount of freedom in that. And again, there is a certain marginalization, because only certain women can achieve that. Women from a certain class who have the money to go to art school, have the money to fund themselves, or their families fund them to go to Europe. They would have to be accompanied by a chaperone. There are restrictions on them, even when they go to Europe.
When Prue heads for Paris in 1925, she stays on the bourgeois right bank, but her spirit lives on the bohemian left bank. Art classes at the École des Beaux-Arts make up for the social restrictions. Here, Prue explores the figure in its purest form. When she returns to Canada, her output increases. At the age of 34, Prudence Hewitt arrives on the Canadian art scene with a series of paintings that take the critics by storm. The proud and defiant farm girl, Rolande. The elegant and abstract At the Theatre. And the powerful figure study, Girl Under a Tree, which wins her the top prize for Canadian art and enough money to head back to Europe. The world of Gertrude Stein and Zelda Fitzgerald. For artists in the 1920s, all roads lead to Paris. For Prue, that road also leads to Canadian painter Isabel McLaughlin.
I was in Paris going to the Scandinavian Academy, and Prue had been over in England, and Alec Jackson knew us both. But we had never met. She lived in Montreal and I was in Toronto. So Alec wrote us both about each other. And so when Prue came to Paris, she wrote me a note, said she'd be at the Ritz, and would I come to tea? So I went to tea, and that's when we first met. We used to go to art galleries together. Well, we had a little trouble at first. Prue wasn't a terribly early riser, and I wasn't a very early riser, so by the time we got there and we're all set to go to the gallery, they were all closed. Of course, you're going to have a gorgeous lunch for 2 hours, you know.
Cafe life and the European tour. Prue sets out for the museums and canals of Venice and sketching trips in the south of France. But nothing compares to the night she spends in Normandy in a small village inn with her friend Isabel.
When I was lying there half asleep, there was a very dim light coming from the window, and I suddenly saw this figure right in front of me, a ghost in either, well, I say a ghost, it was in the costume of either Louis XV or XVI, and I'm not an expert on that, so it was one of the Louis. And I thought, oh my, it was right at the foot of my bed. It was a narrow room, but I thought, goodness. And the beds were fairly close together, so I just pulled the sheet, you see, of Prue's bed right next. And I said, Prue, there's a ghost at the foot of my bed. She said, I don't want to see a ghost, and threw the sheets over her head. She was a person you enjoyed being with. She was self-contained and private, a private person, and intelligent, and also had a very warm heart.
Dearest Isabel, it seems like ages and ages since you were here. I simply loved having you, and everyone who met you reiterates how charming you are. I tell you as one needs these little things to remember in our dark moments. A heap of love. I'm so glad Alex told me to look you up in Paris. As ever, Prue.
At Prue's Peel Street home, life returns to a predictable routine. The morning hours for painting, late afternoons with family and friends. Shared laughter and shared pain. One of the only men Prue ever paints is her favorite brother, Jim. When he marries at the age of 37, Prue stays at home, the sole companion of a powerful mother.
I've often asked myself why it was that, in a sense, she kept so closely within the circle, sort of lived with my grandmother, and didn't in many ways break out, as sometimes artists tend to do, you know, break out in a lifestyle or whatever.
I think that they were brought up in a very difficult time because the mid-Victorian women knew exactly where they stood. We have a great sense of freedom now. They were just in between. And I think, yes, she and my mother had a very difficult time trying to escape from this mold. Would that be the way to put it? And have more freedom to paint and putting it in a nutshell, trying to keep everybody happy, I think wore them down.
Proper middle-class spinster or bohemian artist, shy introvert or sharp-witted public painter. For Prue, the dualities of her own life can explode into defiance or collapse into a dark and quiet resignation.
There is a certain question of dichotomy in her life, because she was living in a very, how shall we say, protected, sort of genteel, almost social sort of environment. But she had this strong need or will to state something, to be something.
In the 1930s, Prue's statements about women become more bold.
One of the most interesting aspects of Prudence Heward's work is the fact that she did deal with sexuality and women in her paintings. For instance, in The Bather, she presents a woman in a very vulnerable, open pose, a pose that has no traditional motif or model for it. And the suggestion in that painting is of a latent sexuality within the figure.
In a self-portrait, Prue launches a direct challenge to traditional views about the role of women in art.
It does have a fascinating sort of sense of what the spirit of that woman might be, or a spirit of woman, and very interesting sort of history in terms of the pose. In the Western tradition of painting, paintings of nudes are of women who are, in a sense, possessed by men. The owner of the picture possesses the nude. The view of the nude is usually a kind of voyeuristic view, as if the nude wasn't at all aware of the male viewer, or even sometimes there are the male viewers that are hidden behind the arras or something of that sort.
The tension in Prudence Heward's work is that she, as the artist, is taking the position of the male gaze, only it is now the female gaze, and so she becomes both the subject and the object of the work. Arthur Lismer did say it was the best nude ever painted in Canada. However, John Lyman, writing in a diary, did not like Girl Under a Tree. He felt that there was too much disruption between the style of the nude and the background.
The opinions of art critics don't seem very important given the broader social problems of the 1930s. Anne Savage experiences the suffering of the Great Depression through the lives of the immigrant children she teaches. Letters from A.Y. Jackson bring comfort and support. But in 1932, as A.Y. approaches his 50th birthday, the tone of his letters to Anne gradually begins to change.
Dear Anne, this birthday rather bewilders me. I'm a complex individual. I have many friends. For some reason, I'm popular without wanting to be so very much. I am pretty happy. Eugene O'Neill says happiness is only a byproduct, that people who search for it never find it. I don't know what little Annie Savage will make of all this. And I wonder if she realized how pretty she looked in that green costume. Or if she knows how many girls come to tea in my studio and tell me I'm wonderful. But she has so much to do. Her life is too full of good deeds to spend time in mere fancies. With all good wishes. As ever, Alex.
Dear Alex, it is a hot, sticky night, and the peonies are heavy in the garden. The dearest little breeze has just sprung up. The air is full of strange ecstasy. I think if you were here, I might be able to talk to you. But then, if you were, no doubt I'd be struck dumb. So, good night to you, Alex. Just forgive my nonsense. Remember, it's nearly 90 degrees in the shade. Intoxicating June. Anne.
That summer, Anne and A.Y. spend their first and only holiday together at Georgian Bay. A few months later, A.Y. proposes. Anne turns him down. Marriage would mean abandoning her mother. It might also mean sacrificing her own career as an artist.
You can get a certain sort of, sheer bliss and satisfaction out of a lovely piece of art, whether you're doing a picture or making a movie or playing the piano or something. And it can be just glorious. And you don't get that out of life relationships because something's always going haywire, It's sort of something goes wrong. And I don't know if anybody ever sits down and thinks, I'm not going to change this art bliss for life imperfection. I don't think you do that. But I think those particular women had art going for them and they loved it. And I don't know what their choices were in the romance field. And so I think they just followed what they found satisfactory.
Dear Isabel, it's cold today. I am resting from painting for a bit and am dawdling away my time and wondering what I'd do with myself if I didn't paint. Marry some poor unfortunate and make him unhappy for the rest of his life as well as myself? Probably.
Prudence Heward finds her strength and inspiration in the company of women. During the summer, members of the Beaver Hall Group congregate at Fernbank, Prue's summer home, sharing ideas and good company. After the stiff society of Montreal, Fernbank is a welcome retreat. Informal gatherings with family and friends. Beach parties and sunbathing on the August long weekend. Nestled on the shores of the St. Lawrence, Fernbank is Prue's spiritual home. A place to relax, to read, and to paint. For friends like Sarah Robertson, Anne Savage, and A.Y. Jackson, Prue's painting picnics represent the high point of any stay at Fernbank.
I can describe as we were leaving and picking up the baskets in the kitchen full of all this wonderful food. It was usually tea time food. And then we'd go and pile into the cars and drive and drive and drive, and then we'd go and sit. And it was funny because people, you know, one would sit here, one would sit here about 100 yards apart, and another would sit here, and they'd all do their own thing, and then at the end compare notes.
I went on at least one of the picnics that the gang went on. I think there must have been at least 10 of them. And Aunt Prue wasn't happy with what she was trying to do, and she said, "Oh, Bobby, you sit, and I'll do you instead."
Prue maintains a special relationship with her nieces and nephews, and a special affection for the land of southeastern Ontario, near the Lynn Valley. A.Y. Jackson observes that Prue's finest landscapes are done in the company of her friend, Isabel McLaughlin.
We were both taught quite differently in our early days. I was taught to make a little sketch in a sketchbook, just, you know, and then draw it, redraw it on the board or whatever, and then start painting. Well, now, Prue's system was quite direct. She would sit down with her panel or whatever, and she would sort of sketch it in lightly in thin color and terps, you see, and then start to paint. About the time I would just be getting into painting, she would be ready to come home.
Here, try one of these.
By the 1930s, the brief summer light is just beginning to fade.
Dear Isabel, Mother and I both down with bronchitis. Mother is recovering more quickly than I, but of course I got hay fever on top of it, and the combination was enough to kill a giant. Sitting at tea, I lost my voice, and that was the beginning. There seems no sense to it.
Chronic asthma restricts Prue's life, but not her will to paint.
Oh, she's a very delicate person. That's why I find these very, very strong paintings unbelievable, because she had delicate hands. She was a delicate person. And to have produced all this strong work, I think, is incredible.
I think she was an absolutely outstanding character painter, not a portrait painter. I feel quite certain in my own mind that portrait painters have to please their subjects. And I just felt that Prue's interpretation would be her own, and if it didn't please the people, well, that could be too bad. But that wasn't the important thing. The important thing was to paint the way she felt.
Dearest Isabel, I believe in painting anything you feel like doing. You always get something different out of a subject. But I know the feeling about doing things other people have done. Did you read Testament of Youth? Quite interesting. In it, someone says, it is either agitation or stagnation. True, isn't it? Too true. With a lot of love from me to you, Prue.
By the mid-1930s, Prue sits at the heart of the Canadian art scene. Vice president of the Canadian Group of Painters, her work shows in galleries around the world. But even at the height of her career, Prue finds herself searching for new inspiration. She discovers it at Isabel McLaughlin's island retreat in Bermuda.
Tropical countries might easily inspire you, the warm, rich colors and light tonalities, contrasts, and pinks and whites and blues and yellows and pale greens in Bermuda. She loved sketching. There was a big garden and many big tropical trees. She would use the part of a house, a wall, a nice curling pink wall, with a black figure, and or she would have the actual sketch, but she might combine parts of that into another painting.
By 1935, Prue has found a powerful new direction for her work.
In a series of black nudes that she painted, this is one of them, Hester from 1938, Prudence begins to deal with some very important issues around the nude. The idea of selecting black women is important, and one has to ask the question, who were these women? Who were the models?
They live at the foot of the hill, and they scrub the floors and polish the windows of homes at the top of the hill. Homes owned by people who would never tolerate the idea of a white woman posing in the nude. Prue's choice of black women is driven by social advantage and aesthetic challenge.
There's a kind of sort of tropical lushness, yet triste tropique sadness to both the expressions on the face and the pose of the body, sort of acceptance of some kind of inevitability, some kind of fate for the body.
Alienation and suffering, defiance and dignity. In the faces of women, Prue explores the strength and fragility of human life. In 1939, Prue's health takes a turn for the worse.
She would have these dreadful asthma attacks, which would knock her out for days or a week or longer, 10 days. I think that was perhaps the only thing that really held her, if it did hold her back.
Dearest Isabel, I'm writing on my knee in the studio as my floor is being polished. All my pictures are sitting around framed, waiting for Jance to call for them. I feel as if I were sitting inside myself. Rooney looking sadly at me, my farmer's daughter reproachfully, Winnie bright but bored. My landscapes say remember, remember. But my petunias are nodding and blowing quite gaily in the breeze.
In 1940, Prue's life begins to change. and painting begins to feel like a race against time. With the coming of the Second World War, tragedy returns to haunt her. It comes in the form of a car crash. Prue injures her painting arm, and the damage to her face makes breathing more difficult. Her friend, Sarah Robertson, remains a steadfast companion. But in the early 1940s, Sarah begins to complain to Prue of a bad hip.
I was upstairs having tea, and Aunt Prue came in the front door, and I remember she couldn't even get up the stairs. She sat on a chair in the hall, and she was wailing, I mean weeping and wailing. You've never heard such a noise. And I remember my grandmother going to the top of the stairs and saying, "What is wrong?" And Prue saying something, I mean, we couldn't understand what she was saying, and eventually it came out that she had just found out that Sarah had cancer.
Despite her illness, Sarah continues to paint. And as Prue happily observes to Isabel, there's life in the old girls yet.
How did you know I've been trying for the last 2 years to get a plant like the one you sent me? I intend to paint it looking down on it, and one looking up with the light through the leaves.
One season fades into another. Autumn remains Prue's favorite time to paint. It suits both her palette and her sensibilities. One of her favorite locations is her sister Honor's home in the eastern townships of Quebec. At the height of the Second World War, Prue's visits with Honor become more frequent. Lost dreams and the ghosts of the First World War have returned to haunt her sister.
Mother was a wonderful person, and she was the last person in the world. She was bright and cheery and tons of fun, and the last person in the world that you would ever feel that would have had a nervous breakdown. Well, she was ill for about 2 years before she died, and very truthfully, I didn't understand what was going on.
In 1943, at a sanatorium in Connecticut, Prue's sister Honor takes her own life.
Dearest Isabel, Honor's death has been a cruel blow to us all, to her husband and children, to poor Mother who has had so much trouble in her life. To me, my personal loss has been so great it staggers me. Honor and I have done everything in our lives together. She was always the most understanding, loving, and loyalist of sisters. So bright and gay and amusing. Always the greatest admirer of my paintings. She loved me and I loved her. She clung to me all through her dreadful illness, and I tried so hard to help her, Izzy. I miss her witty, naughty remarks. However, life is a hard school. We just have to stand up to its blows.
Honor's death marks the beginning of the end for Prue. By 1946, her asthma is so bad that she is forced to give up painting.
Dear Alex, I hope sometime soon you will visit us again at Fernbank. And though it will never be like the old days, it would be lovely to be going on sketching picnics again. I miss my painting terribly, but most of the time I just long for rest and to be able to breathe properly.
I think that she was, wears you down, years of illness like that, and maybe she just didn't have the strength,
In 1947, Prudence Heward suffocates to death at the age of 51.
I just feel, a loss of a great friend. And it seemed early, too early. Great pity. They lost the Canadian art, too.
21 months later, Prue's best friend, Sarah Robertson, dies of bone cancer. Anne Savage will live on until 1971. She writes a fitting epitaph to the life and work of the Beaver Hall women.
As we look around the gallery tonight, it is as if symphonic music was floating through the room, the melody and rhythm flowing and echoing from one canvas to another. With a song of triumph in our hearts, we enter her house of many mansions and go our way rejoicing because of her.
Once she stood at the center of Canadian art. After death, Prudence Heward's work simply vanishes into obscurity. In a world of male masterpieces, women's art has a tendency to disappear.
then we'd break for halfway through the morning for hot chocolate and cookies, and that was a big drawing card for me.
Even her father winds up posing for the young artist. An official with the Canadian Pacific Railway, Arthur Heward is an artist at heart.
Apparently, my grandfather loved the theatre, was very involved with the theatre, and loved music. But I would have thought his love of the theatre may have sort of translated in a funny sort of way to Aunt Prue's need to paint. It's hard to say what real influence he might have had. The strong influence was always my grandmother. She was, as I say, matriarchal, Victorian, and very, very present.
Elegant and straight-laced, Aoife Heward is just one in a long line of matriarchs.
I found all the women of that area a little on the critical side. You know, sometimes I'd be damned if I didn't, be damned if I don't, you know. I found her, I don't know how to classify her. She was my you know, I never sort of thought about it very much. She was my grandmother, and I admired her tremendously. She certainly ran a very tight ship.
For 30 years, Prudence Heward spends every morning alone, painting in her third-floor studio. But she works with the encouragement and support of a tightly knit group of women artists. In January 1920, Prudence Heward and her friends, Anne Savage and Sarah Robertson, join a new association of Canadian painters. They call themselves the Beaver Hall Hill Group, in honor of the Montreal street where their studios are located.
Did you see the paintings? Yeah. How about you? What did you think?
Drawn together by common experiences and a shared artistic vision, their motto becomes, "This above all, to thine own self be true."
With her house.
Aoife Heward rules her 8 children like subjects in a private realm. In the end, she will outlive all but one. In May 1912, her eldest daughter Dorothy dies during her first pregnancy. For Prue, Dorothy's death means the loss of her closest friend. The same week, Prue's father dies. For a shy 16-year-old girl whose own health is fragile, this loss must have seemed impossible to bear. From that point onward, people will observe that there is a watchful sadness about Prue. From the time she is old enough to pick up a pencil, art has been an essential part of Prudence Heward's life. A shy, physically delicate child, she spends hours alone filling up her sketchbooks with drawings. Her eldest sister, Dorothy, offers praise and encouragement. An artist in her own right, Dorothy sketches illustrations for the newspaper, while Prue concentrates on subjects closer to home. Prue will return again and again to the faces of her family as subjects for her paintings. The gaze of a child becomes an open window onto the soul of the future adult.
It must have gone on for at least 10 days. And I sat for 3 hours with breaks quite often, because being 4 years old, it was rather, tough time. And